Thank you. So, tonight my story is going to be about influences in my life. Always reflecting and thinking back how I got to this point, right, in my life, to my love of young people, my love for community, and things of that nature. And so it's always being reflected. So I thought I'd talk about influences. And influences aren't just people. That's the interesting part of that, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Staten Island, New York. I grew up in public housing when it was a real, true community. I often talk about how growing up on 151 Jersey Street in a section called New Brighton was probably the safest I've ever felt in my life, right? Sometimes people think about public housing and the projects and kind of, what goes on there, but actually that's when I first got the first sense of community without knowing that it was community, but it was a place where people took care of each other. It was a place where you met your first and long-lasting friends. It's a place where you learn just about yourself at a young age. Also, a place where we learn survival and things of that nature. So I grew up in a house with my mother and a stepfather. And my sister, I had a little sister. I also had other family members from my father, but that's who I grew up with, my mother, my stepfather. My stepfather was an influence. He taught me one lesson in life. Well, he taught me a lot of lessons, really about going to work, taking care of your family, and things of that nature. But the one thing is interesting how things happen in your life and you pass that on. So I was out probably about 10 years old. I was at a carnival with some friends, and I saw one of his friends, and I asked the guy for a quarter. And by the time I got home, he had opened the door, grabbed me, threw me up against the wall, put his forearm in my chest and said, "You don't ever ask another man for anything. If I can't give it to you, you don't need it." And that's a lesson that I passed down to my kids. And I had to learn that lesson the hard way. But my mother and my stepfather worked really hard. So here I am, I lived in these two worlds. So here I am living in public housing. I attended private school from 1st to 12th grade. So the story goes that I was a genius in kindergarten, so I got kicked out. I don't know what it was, but my mother said that they asked us, they told her that he probably needs a different setting. and so I ended up at St. Peter's Elementary School, where I went to school with a core group of kids from 1st to 8th grade. It's probably about 10 of us who, and there's a great diversity. So that was really my first dealing with diversity, because we all lived in that same neighborhood, but it was white, it was black, it was Puerto Rican. We had someone who came from Poland. So, and these are the folks that we grew up with from 1st to 8th grade. And a couple of other people came and went over the years. There was really that group of 10. And we still keep in touch, basically because of Facebook and things of that nature. But then I was pretty good basketball player, so I was enamored with going to St. Peter's Boys High School, where I had a public school up the street from me, but I always wanted to go to St. Peter's. So here's the difficulty lies, right? So here I am, now I'm living in public housing, and I'm going to this all-boys private school, think Notre Dame or West Haven, okay? And there is when I first encountered racism, right? So I was one of 5 black boys that graduated at a class of, I think it was 145. So that's the first time I was called a nigger and things of that nature. So I had to learn to navigate those spaces. But St. Peter's is also the place I believe I got my affinity and my love for mafia movies. Staten Island is very heavily Italian populated, and a lot of things happen. I'm not going to say anything on camera, but I'm saying, I believe there was a little bit of a mob influence in Staten Island. And I'll tell this one story is my religion teacher was the nephew of Paul Castellano. For those who know, he was the Godfather. But equally not important, but Carmine Bellotti, I was friends with his son, so Carmine Bellotti was the underboss. And if you remember when Paul Castellano got murdered, Carmine Bellotti was murdered along with him. And so I was friends with his son. So one day we had a baseball game, and he says to his father, he says, "Dad, I'm hungry. I need something to eat." And I would think he would say, "Dad, can I have some money? I'm hungry." But it's his dad. So he's like, "Dad, give me some money. I need something to eat." Guy pulls out a wad of money, $100 bills. And he's like, "This is all I have." And he gives it to him. And he says, "Kev, do you want something?" I was like, "No, thanks." I'm good. But so, and that was a little bit of the experience there at St. Peter's. But what that did was I was navigating two worlds, if you can imagine, right? So here I am in my neighborhood. My friends call me white boy, right? Because, not religion, just, a white boy, right? Because, I speak properly, things of that nature. On the flip side, I go into St. Peter's, and now I'm this little black boy from the projects, right? And so it got to the point where even my classmates sometimes, when the city bus would ride by and it was packed, you hear a lot of people say, "Hey, Kev, you missed the bus," my friends, but then you also hear, sometimes, "Oh, nigger," you hear that coming out of the bus window. But overall, it was a pretty good experience. So that's just a backdrop. So my first influence was obviously my family. I mentioned my mother, my stepfather, but my life changed when I think it was 12 years old when my grandmother passed away. So my grandmother was kind of the matriarch of our family. And our family dynamic changed when my grandmother passed away. But she was the love of my life. Whenever I was getting in trouble with my mother, I would call my grandmother and she would say, "Janice, leave that boy alone, come on over." So of course, so sometimes I had to make it up a couple of times too, right? She wasn't really doing anything to me, but I wanted to go to grandma, so I would make something up. And then she would tell her, "Come on over." But then also I had 5 aunts and uncles. It was 5 aunts and 4 uncles, I believe it was, right? Brian, Patrick, Joe. 3 uncles that were very dear to me. So they helped raise me as well. And my aunts, whenever, they used to call me spoiled, rotten. I think it was because of my aunts who did it, right? They really loved on our family. The second influence, and I said it was about not just about people, about places. So it's this park right next to my building. It's called Mahoney Park, but we just affectionately known as the park. And the park is where I learned every life lesson, right? Good, bad, and different happen in that park. But it's a time when we were playing, where we played. So a day in the park could consist of playing Scalzi, playing hopscotch. It was nothing for us. It wasn't uncommon for us to play basketball, baseball, football, all in one day in this park. But it's also where, you learn other skills in the park, right? You learn how to make friends. You learn how to lose friends. You learn conflict resolution. You learn group dynamics, right? There was this guy, a good friend of mine, Orrin. We call him Scoring Orrin because to me, he was the best basketball player ever, and he never played high school basketball because he couldn't fit into a structure. But we played a lot of street basketball, and he was one of the best basketball players I've ever seen, but he's also the toughest one in the neighborhood. So kind of when we were, whether we're choosing team or something's going on, he usually had the last word, right? But you get that friend, but you can needle him and him or her. He'll take care of you, but other people didn't end so well for a couple of people. I'll tell you this one time we were playing basketball, and me and the other friend, we were rubbing him, and we were getting under his skin, and he was really upset. So we go up to play basketball with some older guys, and one of the older guys said something to him. Well, he got into a little conflict resolution going on, and then my other friend turns to me and he says, "Kevin, now it's supposed to be your ass whooping." But so we learned, right, conflict resolution. We learned leadership skills, right? As simple as when it was time if we wanted to play baseball, we didn't have even numbers. So what do? You make up rules. So one of the rules was if we didn't have 9 people, we didn't have a right fielder. So if you hit it to right field, if you were a left-handed batter and you hit it to right field, it was an out. And then they switched it around. If you're a right-handed batter, if you hit it to left field, you were out. And so that's the type of things that you learn. You learn rules. You learn how to make games work. And we had this one thing. So now we call this generation the trophy generation. So this would never fly where what happened now. We had this thing called CBO. It was called change in batting order. So when it was your last ups and your team was losing the baseball game, you could change the batting order. And so inevitably, the person who was supposed to be up didn't get his ups. But we were just, and so nowadays kids get upset if they don't get picked. Like, you were just really happy to get picked. So it didn't matter if you were the 5th person for basketball or the 9th player for baseball or whatever number you're doing with football. And I think that goes back to part of when I talked about the leadership skills you learn and your coping skills and things of that nature, right? Instead of, storming off and saying, I'm not playing, you say, I just want to get in where I fit in. And I come from an era where, so right now, Karen mentioned that I coach a lot of basketball, I coach AAU basketball, right? Travel basketball. If you win by 20 points or you lose by 20 points, you're gonna play another game in 2 hours. Whereas back in the day, when you were on the big court, if you lost and you weren't good enough to get picked up again, you might not get back on the big court for another 3-4 hours. Right? And so that means, and we would go play in the scrub court or whatever the case may be. So I think, again, so that's the coping stuff that comes in. You learn how to deal and you learn how to be tough, right? Talk about we learned our negotiating skills, organizational skills. It was nothing for us to, and we didn't have cell phones and all that, but we always knew we had a game against another neighborhood, right? So someone always organized another game against another neighborhood. And not only that, the same guy, Orrin, would get our money, right? And he'd go, hey, you gotta go order uniforms, so we'd all get on a bus, go to this place called Steckman's, get our uniforms, and we'd be ready to play in the game. It could only be 1 game or 20 games, but we were gonna have these uniforms. And Orrin said, if you didn't have your uniform, you couldn't play. So we would always have our uniform. So that was the skills that we learned in this park. It's also I hope I'm not revealing too much, right? But as we got older, what would happen, the older guys would be upstairs, up in the park, and they'd be doing their thing on Friday nights. So as we got old enough, right, we wanted to emulate them. So we'd be down in the little park doing our thing. And the night always ended with them coming, surrounding us, taking our stuff, and leaving. But the rub was, we couldn't tell our parents what happened. So we just had to learn. And then, of course, it trickles down. So when we got to be older, right, we learned to use the same tricks on the other kids in little right? So that's, and the park is near and dear to my heart. It's just so much stuff happened in that park. That's where we used to have our block parties. So for those who don't know, the DJ would come late at night. They'd set up the equipment, run it through someone's apartment, plug it in, and you'd have a party. And of course, the cops would come, tell us to shut it down, so we shut it down. Cops leave, turn it back on, and you party all night. So one night we went on this trip. We went to the Statue of Liberty. We were going to get records because we thought we were a crew. We were DJs, MCs, breakdancers. We had our crew, and we're like 12 years old. And this is our first time going into Manhattan because we used to travel by the Staten Island Ferry. So it was our first time going into Manhattan by ourselves. Here we are, 12, 13 years old. So I remember this older guy who, if I'm thinking now, he's probably about 19 to 20. I see him, right, he's an older guy. I see him talking, we see him talking to one of our friends. And then all of a sudden the friend ducks off, he goes, run, he goes, he's trying to rob us, right? And so we all kind of scatter. And then there's this place, so we always on the Manhattan side of the Staten Island Ferry, there was this pizza shop that you always had to get pizza to get on the ferry. So we all meet back up at this place. And we had a friend who was a big guy, let's just so say. And we were all getting pizza. And then he wasn't getting pizza. And we were like, why, you not hungry? No, I'm not. You're like, wait a minute. Did he catch you? So we made this pact. We made this pact that we were gonna say anything, right? We get back. So that night, one of those block parties is happening. And then the neighborhood jokester, someone must have told him, because he gets on the mic, turns the music down, and said, I just want everyone to know that such and such got robbed tonight. And he was so upset at us. I was like, it wasn't me. Hey, I promise it wasn't me. So that's, like I said, a lot of things happened in that park. So now, the influence, back to the people. So Staten Island, how many people are familiar with Staten Island? Okay, Staten Island is, so New York City is probably the most segregated city in the country, right? Staten Island was, well, let's put it this way, Staten Island went for Trump, okay? So, and it's a notorious, it's gotten better, but it was, growing up, it was pretty bad place. There was this place in Rosebank, it was called, they had it written on the wall, it was called No Nigger Land, right? But I learned this recently. I was always wondering why most of the predominantly black folks were concentrated in the North Shore of Staten Island. And that's, if you come up the Verrazano Bridge and then, you go down Bay Street, Jersey Street, Richmond Terrace, into Park Hill, Stapleton, is where all of predominantly black people was concentrated. And I just learned recently it was because when they were building the Verrazano Bridge, white people in Staten Island said, we don't want them, so the Verrazano Bridge is actually the marker, like where they didn't want black and Puerto Rican people to live. So they had to go north of the Verrazano Bridge, and that's how it ended up being on the North Shore. So the four men, so I'm gonna tell you about Charles Papa Brown, Wayne Chops Derrick, Paul Light, and my Uncle Eddie. So Charles Papa Brown, I met him when I was in 7th grade because his son, Alan, came to St. Peter's Elementary School. Now, you gotta understand this. I had been the man of the class for 6 years. So one day the teacher said, we had a guy, Alan Halfinger, we had a guy, Tom Brown. So one day the teacher is saying, Alan Brown. And we're like, there's no Alan Brown. Like, it's Alan Halfinger and it's Tom Brown. What are you talking about? He's like, no. And it was this guy, Paul Light, right? He said Alan Brown. Whatever. 10 minutes later, here comes this gangly black kid walking into the classroom. And he's like, I'm Alan Brown. We're like, oh. So I was like, okay. So we got to talk. I asked him 2 questions. I said, where are you from? He was from Stapleton, another section. And I said, can you play basketball? He was like, yes. So he's been my best friend since then. Right? He was the best man at our wedding. I was the best man at his wedding. But his father, that's when I met his father. And it was the first time, that I saw a total family unit in public housing. People had fathers, they knew their father. I'm not gonna say they didn't know their fathers, but stuff happened, right? Divorce and things of that nature. But this was, when I would go to the house, it was like the first time I saw it like that together. Mother, father, 3 kids. But he became like a father to me. His influence was undeniable, and if I tell you, he almost had me going through the Knights of Columbus. That's how influential he was in my life. But then once we went through a couple of stages, I realized, I said, well, this seems a little too much like the Klan, so I'm but he stayed in. But he just taught, he's another one who just taught us values, right? He taught us, he was stern, but he always talked to us about, being successful, finishing school. He was our basketball coach, traveled us around. And he even let Alan use his car when Alan got a license. And so one day Alan told me, he said, I'm on my way, be outside. And so I'm sitting here, and here comes Alan in this K car. Remember those old back in the day? But you know what it was like. I was like, I can't have my friends think I'm getting into the police car. Golly, you gotta meet me around the corner, man. But Mr. Brown was a huge influence in Alan's life, obviously, but also in ours. And whenever I went to his house, it was like he treated me just like family. So he was the first he was an influence. And then there's this guy, Wayne Chops Derrick. So Wayne Chops was, so let me tell you this. So between Eddie and Chops. So as I was saying about Staten Island being really racist city at the time. So I didn't know this. There was always basketball tournaments going on in my neighborhood. Always basketball games, basketball leagues. My Uncle Eddie was involved in Staten Island. This guy, Wayne Chops Derrick, was influential on another neighborhood. So about 4 or 5 of them. But when they honored these 2 gentlemen at a dinner is when we really heard the story. They said and what I got out of the story, the courage of these men. Because you got to think, my Uncle Eddie started coaching basketball right out of high school. So he's 19 years old. These men fought City Hall and won because there was nothing for kids in our neighborhood. And they said the story they told about how these men went to City Hall, were almost arrested, put through the ringer just trying to get some money and activities for us in Staten Island. And that's part of the influence that I have between Chops and my Uncle Eddie. So I'll tell you about Chops. So Chops is actually the stepfather of one of my good friends, Dave McGoy. And we used to have this thing called Citywide. So every park in New York on a Saturday and Sunday it was called Citywide. And just basketball tournament, they had these great shirts, and all you wanted was to play in Citywide. Here we are, these guys from Staten Island, getting on the ferry, going to Brooklyn, going to Queens to play basketball. So the championship game was at Madison Square Garden. So that was a dream, to get to the Garden. And Staten Island, only one team went, and they won. It was the guy, Wayne Derricks, one of his sons' team went. But Chops was trying to get me to play on one of the teams that was going. But it wouldn't work out. They wouldn't let him change the roster. But I just always, he was another one, just encouraged us to play as much as we can, stay out of trouble. But he was just a really great community man. And you know someone's a great community man when they name something after you. So a couple of years ago, they named the street after him. So it wasn't just the basketball, it was just giving us access and giving us opportunity to do that. But he was a cool customer too. People were getting out of control, and Chops would just walk over and be like, listen, man, we ain't gonna have none of that in here. And that was it, right? And then Paul Light. So Paul was a teacher, but Paul Light, I told you this section called Rosebank. His family lived there. And in 7th, 8th grade, he was our 7th, 8th grade teacher. I was a pain in the butt to him, right? But we went to high school, and he was our he was a music teacher. But when we got to high school, he graduated from St. Peter's 10 years earlier than we did. So he was a young teacher. But we formed this singing group. And Paul was the piano player, and we were these five. Now, listen, they tried to name us the Ink Spots. But we weren't having that. So we ended up being the future generation. And we would go around places and sing. And people would actually pay us to sing, right? We get a little money. And so one day we were singing for some event, and Vanessa Williams was there, Miss America, right? She was there. We sang for Miss America, and she was talking to us. And Karen, I have to say, if the security guard wouldn't have taken her away, things might be a little different. But the security guard whisked her away, so but that's it. We got to sing. But what happened was, Paul became a mentor to us, and he would let us come to his house, and his family brought us in. His family accepted Alan and I. It got to the point where we had keys to the house. And my mother was really worried about me going to this neighborhood, whatever. One night, as Alan and Paul and I were walking down the street, someone threw a bottle at us, right? And so, because the neighborhood hadn't changed at that point, but his family stayed steadfast. And they opened their home to us, they opened their home to our families. And then as we got older in high school, well, then that became the place that we did things, We hung out, you know what I mean? That's where we hung out, you know what I mean? And but Paul was a great influence. He's actually the person who, when I was first coming to Southern Connecticut, Paul would, on Sunday night, drive me up here to Connecticut, and then turn around and go back home and things like that. Just a really good man and good soul and a good family. And then Uncle Eddie. So you see this shirt. I have a program called Young Life. I've always had this thing this idea I wanted to do this program, and I was going to name it Young Life. And the reason is, when I was playing basketball in New Brighton, our team was called Young Life. And Uncle Eddie was the one who ran the program. So Uncle Eddie is my father's uncle, and I really believe that he was stepping in, compensating because my father was nowhere to be found in my life, but Uncle Eddie was. Uncle Eddie worked for the Parks Department in New York City. He got me a job at the Parks Department going back over the summers when I was in school. But what he did for the community, when he passed away a couple of years ago, he had been coaching for over 45 years. So he had coached people's, like there were people saying it was like grandkids, like had played for him. They played for him, their kids played for him, and their grandkids had played for him. He did training. He was a guy who, and for a good portion, he didn't have a car, but he was always everywhere. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, taking teams and playing. And my mother told me the other day, she's like, well, you know, Uncle Eddie used to always come and get you. And I didn't remember. I think I was telling Karen, like when I was trying to get a story in my head, I was like, I don't know where my story begins, right? I always had this picture of me being maybe 8 years old when I met my first friends, but other stuff is kind of a blur. But my mother said that Uncle Ed would come get me every Saturday and Sunday to go play basketball. But he was tough. So our tryouts, we used to run from my neighborhood to another neighborhood. And we used to say, so we really want us to run in Stapleton? The Paris crew is in Stapleton. Why are we running over there? The Paris crew is this notorious gang in Stapleton, you know. But he would always be on a 10-speed bike. He'd just show up out of some side street on a 10-speed bike, catching people walking and stuff like that. I don't know how he did it, but he's another one. Last year, I think it was, they named the corner of my block where I grew up, Jersey Street and Crescent, they named it Eddie Watkins Way, right? So again, there's another powerful, very influential, but never full of himself. You know, but when you do that type of work, you make enemies over the years, right? People don't like you for whatever reason. But the outpouring of love that he received when he got sick and also when he passed away, you know, at that point I decided like that's who I've been trying to be like my whole life. It was like Uncle Eddie. And I don't know if it was because Uncle Eddie was there for me when his brother wasn't, but you know, so he was a huge influence in my life. And so the fourth one is Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. So when I first came to college, I had a good friend named James Ellis, who was a year ahead of me. And he had been telling me about this fraternity that he wanted to pledge. And then I got on campus, I got to know the gentlemen. And they were doing all the really great things at Southern Connecticut. So I decided that's what I wanted to do. And so they crossed in 1988, they pledged. And I didn't have the opportunity to do it then. And so for the next 4 years, they kept saying, all right, yep, this is the year. Yeah, for 4 years, nothing happened, right? But I got my opportunity in 1992. And for that, given that opportunity, I have gotten the opportunity to travel, but also just meet some really, really good people in the fraternity. You know, fraternities often get a bad rap about the way they pledge and things of that nature, but Omega Psi Phi, besides, you know, marrying Karen and being that family, Omega Psi Phi is probably one of the, joining Omega Psi Phi is probably one of the top 5 things I've done in my life. And to this day, we remain active. I have the opportunity to serve on a national level as a Omega Life Membership Chairman, Region Director. And so what we do is we manage the fraternity's money at a tune of about $5 million. We give out over $300,000 in scholarships annually, which we will do in Atlantic City in a couple of weeks. I'm the chairman for the grants committee, where we give away $50,000 in grants to programs throughout the country. But Omega Psi Phi has also made me a better man, right? Because it forces you to. The pledge process has a lot to do with that, right? But also just having, because you know, it's just in your heart, right? And so, and it also gives us access, and I think this is what I tell my fraternity brothers all the time. Being a member of this organization gives us access to, you know, whatever, jobs and networking, but for me, it gives you access to the community, right? Because it still stands for something. And people see Omega Psi Phi, principals want us in the schools doing work with kids. When we're able to do work in the community, we work together with all the other fraternities and sororities. But it's just really about the fact that for me, it's a badge of honor, but it's been so influential in my life that it makes me want to do better every day. And I think the last influence, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Karen, Kevin, and Caleb. Karen took a chance on me, right? Because, I ain't gonna tell you how we met. We don't want to tell that story. Maybe another time about how we met and everything. So for the next time. But it's again, she has helped me. She has helped me become a better person, a better man. And then our two boys, and that's what we live for, right? Kevin and Caleb. And again, they force you to be good. They force you to be better. Because at the end of the day, I want to be a father where they see, right? Not necessarily about my words or my actions and things like that. I mean, not my words, but it's really about my actions, okay? About how Karen and I are always doing work in the community and how service is really what drives us. And service is what needs to drive them. And we're happy to say that it does. Caleb a little more than Kevin, but Kevin's gonna get there through his art because he's a hip hop artist. And a shameless plug, he'll be performing June 21st on the Green. So what happened with that though, we never knew this kid could rap, right? And so one day he says he's gonna do a mixtape. And then Karen and I go, what? A mixtape? You're a rapper? Okay. I was a rapper back in the day, so, why are we laughing? So I said to him, listen, the best thing you can do as a hip hop artist, right, is to be true to yourself. So you're not a gangster, you're not a street kid, we're not gonna have all this, your mother needs to be able to listen to it, your grandmother needs to be able to listen to it, and we're happy to say, first of all, that he's really good, right? He has 2 mixtapes, and he has about 35 songs that he's done, and only 1 song did he use a curse word. And he told us he used a curse word because it was in the concept of the song, what he was saying. And so he stayed true to that, and so we're supportive of him in that. And then Caleb, he was the NAACP Youth Council president. He's the NAACP secretary at the University of Hartford. But he tested us a couple of weeks ago because he was taking a summer class, and then he comes home and he says, my dean said that I should commute because it's only 1 class and it's only 3 hours. So for a whole weekend, Karen and I are going back and forth like, can this kid drive? But we were worried as parents that he had to drive to Hartford during rush hour for 2 weeks. And we're worried about him, and we don't hear from him. Karen, you heard from Caleb? No. But I think that's a good thing. If we didn't hear from him, right? And then we get home, Caleb, you gotta text us. And you're like, oh, my bad. And so, but what that made me do, it made me realize how much me not going back home, I often wonder how that impacted my mother. Because when I left in 1986, I essentially never lived with my mother again. I would go home, but sometimes I would go home, and I would go home on Friday. I wouldn't see her till maybe Sunday when it was time to leave. And so I think about that behavior, how that impacted her. And I'm gonna ask her about that because, she knew I was coming home, but she didn't see me. And that's how I feel with our kids when they come home. And I mean, the first time it was hurt, like they would come home like, all right, I'm out. And then Karen was like, well, you did the same thing, I'm pretty sure. So there was that perspective there, so. But that's really it. I think that was my story of influences, mentors, and I think that's what drives me to want to give back to the community the way I do. And the last note, because I'm getting a wrap-up sign, my mother moved out of our apartment that she lived in for 47 years. She moved out last week, and she moved in with my niece. They bought a house, another part of Staten Island. But after 47 years, and she didn't want to go. She didn't want to go, but we were able to talk her into saying this is best for you now. The neighborhood has changed, the people have changed, and it probably wasn't as, she didn't feel as safe as she had in the past. So with 47 years, she was packing for like how long? 6 months? She was packing for a long time. So that's it. So thank you. Thanks for listening.